Radical Dharma, Talking Race, Love, and Liberation, written by Reverend Angel Kyoto Williams, Lama Rod Owens, with Jasmine Syedullah, Ph.D. Radicalizing Dharma Dreams, by Jasmine Syedullah, Ph.D. Quote, "On truth's path, wise is mad, insane is wise. In love's way, self and other are the same. Having drunk the wine, my love, of being one with you, I find the way to Mecca, and Bodh Gaya are the same." End quote. Number 302 from Rumi's Kulliyat-e-Shams-e-Tabrizi. Quote, "All that is deeply true is a paradox." End quote. Reverend Angel Kyoto Williams, Sensei. Why not sit? Why not stop the Ferris wheel only to sit on a rainbow-colored steel horse for a while? Neither people watching nor waiting, but just sitting. To find peace? To escape the hustle and bustle of this life, its rushed hours and heartbreaks, its delusions and disappointments. Perhaps because in the act of sitting, there is nothing to be attained. Strangers at the gates. There came a time in my own practice when the lofty dreams and abstract ideals that originally compelled me toward a cushion, a mat, a sangha or tradition of wisdom teachings began to dissolve. I didn't find nirvana on my cushion. I did, however, find something in the depths of the night, surrounded by police, sitting on a cushion while holding vigil with thousands before the gates of a federal prison. It was the evening of December 12th. The year was 2005. I had traveled with my sangha from Oakland to the foothills of Marin to participate in a talk led by Reverend Angel and Jack Cornfield at Spirit Rock. At that point, it was the most racially mixed, densely populated Buddhist gathering I'd ever seen. After the talk, several of us bundled up with blankets, hats, scarves, and warm jackets with our meditation cushions in tow and headed to San Quentin in protest of the state-sanctioned execution of a man named Stanley Tookie Williams. Williams had been arrested, convicted, and sentenced to death in the early 80s. He had spent more than 20 years on death row. He had entered prison the co-founding leader of one of the most notorious gangs in America, the Crips. By the time of his execution, he had become a Nobel Peace Prize nominee 5 times over for his violence prevention efforts with urban youth. He was globally celebrated by noteworthy public figures and respected by national progressive organizations. That night, he was to suffer death by lethal injection. We heard the chants before we saw their faces. Hundreds packed the vacant streets that led to the prison gates. The shouts cut through the cool nighttime air, calling us all to come together. We rolled in, chanting, bathed in the intermittent light of hard flashes from the big local news cameras and the flickering glow of white-stemmed candles that cast an eerie light across a sea of unfamiliar faces. We, the urban sangha, joined a motley crew of anarchists, preachers, politicians, white liberals, black Muslims, communists, hip-hop moguls, and blue-clad Crips. We were flanked by quiet rows of surprisingly passive police. We were flowing together like a river towards the gates of the prison. We are, I thought silently, the strange bedfellows of the next social revolution. Our walking meditation winded along a seemingly endless pathway until we arrived at a clearing, lines of protesters spilling out of formation and pooling in dense crowds before the police-lined and barricaded West Gate of California's oldest institution of incarceration, San Quentin State Prison, home to the state's only gas chamber and death row. We were there for Williams, not because, like Troy Davis, we believed he was innocent. Though many believed he was not guilty of the crimes for which he had been sentenced, and though I had no doubt he had contributed violent acts, I was also certain those actions should not cost him his life. The propensity for violence for which the law held him accountable was not his alone to own. The historical conditions of its formation rose alongside the globalization of the U.S. empire that sowed the seeds of 9/11, arming Afghan mercenaries with military weapons and training them to fight Soviet soldiers in a war without end. Williams was no saint, but like many of us, he was invested in healing himself and the community that he had helped to harm. For the last several years of his incarceration, he spent his time writing children's books, giving public talks, and creating online educational resources designed to prevent young men like him from following the path that he himself had chosen. Tookie's was the hard-won kind of autocorrect that reflected our own need for another chance, for forgiveness, for something with longer-term visions of justice than retributive justice can afford, for something beyond the cycle of punishment, exile, and annihilation we erect around those whose presence poses a clear and present danger to our sense of safety. The evening felt surreal, like midnight might strike and some old tension might break, give way to the improbable. Maybe a miracle. Posters bearing his words and his face filled the air. The voices of the few capital punishment supporters were consumed by a sea of Williams advocates, drowned out by our fiery calls for his immediate release from death row. We placed meditation cushions in a circle on the concrete pavement and sat in the midst of the crowd, bringing stillness into the roar of 5,000 from the coolness of the ground. In the silence, I could feel it all, the grief, the rage. Injustice has a flavor, a smell. It chokes the breath and burns the gut. It rises through the body like poison, like fire. I sat until I couldn't sit anymore. My wavering voice joined the others. At the 11th hour, phone in hand, I scrolled the news updates in search of the latest, a sign that the fate of the condemned may still be stayed. Quote, "Without an apology and atonement for these senseless and brutal killings, there can be no redemption," end quote. A quote from then Governor Schwarzenegger read. I braced myself. Tookie was being punished for dedicating his children's book about the danger of gangs to political prisoner George Jackson and Black Panther Party leader Huey P. Newton. He was being killed as much for his affiliation with enemies of the state as he was for choosing self-defense over violating the trust of those who put their trust in him. Rather than informing on the internal affairs of gang life, he was choosing to align himself with the nameless, those with no selves to defend from the threat of death row. I clasped hands with strangers. We wrapped each other's rage up with our voices. We stood as one terrific body of dissent against the cold and death, armed with nothing but the fullness of our attention, our witness, our whole selves. In the earliest hour of morning, more than half an hour past midnight, it was announced. Stanley Tookie Williams had become the 12th person to be legally executed by the state of California since the reinstatement of that brutal and dehumanizing practice in 1978. Though his personal transformation was not enough to convince Governor Schwarzenegger that his life was worth saving, it was not an event that passed unnoticed. Self-defense in this context is, like violence, never an individual act. Self-defense becomes possible through the cooperation of many forces, people, ideas, movements, and wars. Instead of the image of self-defense we are used to, something like a high noon standoff at the OK Corral, it might be more like a scene from a horror movie, something like a zombie feeding frenzy. An early scene, a mob attack in a populated area, the frantic funneling of senseless force against an immediately imposing and clearly imminent threat. Are they mad or just hungry? Everyone fears the zombies. No one suspects the humans are zombicidal. Introduction to meditation. So why sit? It couldn't save Stanley. It didn't start a revolution. At the beginning, I picked up sitting as a means to an end, another way to achieve. The best way to arrest what Augusto Boal calls the cops in your head. I was using meditation to police the police, so to speak, adopting their instruments of surveillance, punishment, exile, and control in service to my own liberation. It was not working. It gave me a reason, a purpose, a way out of my head, but not a way out of my habits of self-isolation, the deepest lie of this heteronormative, hero-obsessed culture, believing that the only one I could rely on to save me was myself. What was first a refuge became its own prison. After sitting with those who stood for Tookie, my deep and abiding suspicion that prisons cannot keep us safe and that criminalization was not in the common interest of justice became more than a cause. It became a calling. Being fully in the stillness was not about self-isolation or self-help, but about standing in radical relationship with all that stillness holds, with all the grief, all the loss, all the loneliness, and for a moment, no matter what, sitting with it, rather than rushing to reason it away, arrest it, lock it in a box, and throw away the key. Nothing can truly be destroyed this way. Not even the dead stay buried. When I first came to Reverend Angel's Sangha and the fearless warrior practice she was developing, it made me so uncomfortable that she had to teach it to me about 10 times. The instruction was to keep our eyes slightly open rather than completely closed. It was not just difficult to remember, but it was irritating. I preferred instead to seal myself off from the world, content that the Dharma dreams that danced behind blissfully pulled lid screens were what was working for me. It took months to unlearn the habits of sitting in isolation I had picked up from the academy. Even after much instruction, I was struggling to notice what I was doing, to stop and to start again. In order to embody the practice of sitting in meditation, as if I were on the edge of a battlefield awaiting my cue to combat rather than atop a mountain in the clouds, I'd come to see what all I feared to face in my practice, in myself. The older practices were not wrong. They were, however, alibis in my own desire to appear unflappable while actually managing to be still hiding from myself. The meditative stance of the fearless warrior was not that of the Christian monk, nor the Eastern ascetic. She was fearless warrior living in a city, not a monastic alone on a mountain. Her senses were poised for action, fully present, alive, relaxed, embodied, alert. Thus, her eyes remained slightly open and cast down at a 45-degree angle with the ground, gazing gently ahead in order to maintain detached connection with the world and an aptitude of readiness to rejoin it whenever the need arose. In the practice, we move in response to bells rather than bullets. In the service, we learn to invite the sound of the bell as an extension of the practice, not as an anxious exit strategy. We lead the chant because a strong, steady pace must be set, and a container for others must be held, not because we excel in mastering protocol and serving up convincing performances of leadership. There can be an implicit shadiness in the retreat to monastic life within the cosmopolitan exigencies of urban existence. A kind of entitled solipsism, an air of self-righteousness that can accompany the Dharma talk that romanticizes the merits of meditation as a priority and thus as justification for withdrawing from direct forms of engagement with things as they are, with injustice, inequity, pain, injury, disease, violence, apathy, ignorance, neglect. When we move as one in the practice hall, we are peaceful. This is not necessarily so when we leave it behind for the hard ground of public protest. The fear of mob mentality in our modern civilized culture is a curious one. We can trace it back to Cold War anxieties or fear of slave uprisings. At the end of the day, the assumption that crowds acting in concert need to be controlled taints our everyday connections to feeling each other, to feeling interconnected. It makes us fear those we learn to call strangers. It makes us strange in the presence of the unknown. A sitting practice is about more than seeking peace. It is self-defense, more than a dream state of good intentions that are quote-unquote useful for becoming less wound up in the spin cycle of day-to-day life. It is also the most powerful weapon in the face of insurmountable horror, a way to stop even the cops in the midst of everything and stand at the gates of the prison as many made one to confront the coming threat head-on. We might not save anyone. We might have to bear witness to an execution. But we were there. We were taking note, paying attention, and because we were there, it was not a moment that went unnoticed. "Do you want to be asleep or awake?" the teacher asked, and the student allowed her eyes to open slightly. She drew them down, gently casting a 45-degree angle with the ground, already more steady, more present to herself, ready to meet whatever might arise. In following the instruction, I dared my Dharma practice to wake up, come out of isolation and become animated, to come out of a space of suspended good faith, to become a practice that lived both on and off the cushion, bringing me more present to myself and closer into the world. The fearless warrior practice trained me to sit with all my internal cops and unconscious prisoners, the guilty, the innocent, the ghosts, the saints, and the monsters. It gave me a chance to see all their strange and idiosyncratic machinations and take note of their marionette-like possession of my sense of self, my disgust, my shame, my self-preservation. I began to study the waxing and waning of my own prison house of selves like a beloved guardian, until my own attachments to their coming and going became increasingly more familiar and less startling to me. The steady routine of my own punitive reactions to my missteps became more readily recognizable over time as a discrete series of feelings and activities I rely on and engage for real reasons instead of a set of crimes to be controlled and corrected. The tendency to police becomes less compulsive, more conscious with practice. Abandoned pieces, places, and people cut off become inhabitable, hospitable, less hostile. What if we went there, away from reliance on police, cuffs, kill shots, and cages? What if we flocked? What if we crowded conventions of justice with conduct becoming a more collective vision of freedom? Do we police because we fear we can be savages? Do our barricades from each other belie the blinds that keep us strangers to ourselves? Any given someday. It is not enough to know we want freedom. We have to practice it. We have to be able to live it out together. Remind each other how messy practice can be, but rally each other to keep going for it. It might not make sense. It might not appear reasonable. Knowing we want freedom is a practice in presence, not fortune-telling, not storytelling. There are no guarantees, no gold stars for having arrived on the other side perfectly unscathed, no chance of anyone nailing a perfect landing anyhow. The skillfulness required to still all forms of policing, punishment, and separation we typically bring to our practices of liberation is not a matter of mastery. Our individual attempts to brace ourselves from the presence of each other are messy, angry, and hurtful. We throw up borders of separation to keep ourselves safe and somehow manage to find ourselves more miserable. So often, the ways I hear folk talk about practice and represent its value are wrapped up in the idea that freedom is a means to an end, especially within the U.S. context, given our particular historical relationship to freedom being legally and morally bound up in discourses of property, entitlement, mastery, exchange, dispossession, and exclusion. What if freedom is not a means to an end, full of more comforts than this moment, right now? We may yet be further inconvenienced along the way. In January 2015, I sat in a zendo at Brooklyn Zen Center. It was nearly MLK Day. We chanted the words of his speech, a time to break silence in unison. Calling out in one voice his words, "True compassion is more than flinging a coin to a beggar. It is not haphazard and superficial. It comes to see that an edifice which produces beggars needs restructuring. A true revolution of values will soon look uneasily on the glaring contrast of poverty and wealth and say, this is not just." The Western arrogance of feeling that it has everything to teach others and nothing to learn from them is not just. A true revolution of values will lay hands on the world order and say of war, this way of settling differences is not just. Singing together, "We shall overcome," gave me great hope because it was clear that here in this space we were claiming the dream of liberation as something other than a good intention or a romantic destination. The navel-gazing attention on the self I had come to expect to be fractured was being very explicitly redirected to a call for wholeness and an end to injustice. In Reverend Angel's talk that day, she reminded us all of the importance of not getting caught up in the hand-wringing that comes with worrying over what we ought to do with the obstacles to our liberation. That we stop checking out, check in, and work together to try to do things in ways we might not yet know how to, is more important than knowing the right thing to do. Bodies are dropping while we are debating. She said, the incessant preoccupation with trying to name the first thing to do can be itself a hindrance. Radicalizing Dharma dreams of liberation into political practice is no guarantee that we'll be free from spaces of confusion, pain, separation, and suffering. We must begin to practice sitting together, to stand together. The teacher also talked about remembering to make room at the table of our suffering and sadness for joy. Deep in my heart, someday, I believe, singing the song of uncertainty in this instance was anything but reason for misery or resignation. It was a triumphant testament to the glory of love, a way of making room for that which we can't yet know and can't wait for any longer. Love is liberation, and liberation is love, especially when you are pretty sure you cannot win. We can still wrap each other up in our chanting voices, add our radical love to the feelings of despair, keeping our eyes open, senses alert. You never really know what might happen. This is how I want to learn to want to be free. Not in search for a perfect monastic mountaintop, far away from the problems of the world, but on the ready, among the many, singing each other's radical wisdom, waking up to ourselves, our dead, to their hearts and hunger, to their dreams of someday, I believe. As an activist academic, I often cringe at such touchy-feely sentiment. There is no time for feelings. The endless crunch of priorities punishes me for stopping long enough to notice my rage wreaking havoc on my body. It is not an accident. In the rush of the endless ways we find ourselves lost, late, behind, functioning beneath our best intentions and expectations. I didn't sit today does not generally rise to the top 10 list of reasons we find ourselves lying awake in the middle of the night. So, why sit? A friend wrote me the other day telling me of her upsetting encounter with egoism in the academy, and she said, quote, "I don't know if I can last long in this world," unquote. I responded not with blind optimism, but with the improvisational spirit of one for whom liberation from suffering is not an entitlement, but a practice. What if the thing that has to go because something's got to give is anxiety itself, I said. What if managing the fear or falling off this Ferris wheel or anticipating its flying off its supports is just too exhausting? Instead of propping oneself up on lofty expectations or dropping the ball on our responsibility to ourselves, to our work, to being present, to caring for each other, what would it look like to cut off our attachment, that hardwired sense of obligation to staying stressed? The Ferris wheel can't stop, won't stop, but we can. We can just sit on a rainbow-colored steel horse for a while and just watch the wildings of fear wreak havoc on our sense of safety. Ride and watch. Witness and wilding. Quote, "We are experimenting with new strategies for survival," I told my friend. Their efficacy is necessarily not reflected in dominant culture, and yet throughout history we hear stories of folks refusing competition in precisely this way and daring to walk together to another rhythm. The fact that this bluesy fugitive rhythm does not work in this world is proof of its success. We just have to remember we are not alone in this journey. We sit to practice being with ourselves so we can better sit, love, and live with those who will show up and help us along the way. We are not yet drones. We can still clear some cobwebs, tend to some wounds, and invite our bodies into practices of looking. We can cut through all that separates us from ourselves, and ourselves from each other with a breath, maybe two. We can believe, broaden ground, offer new direction. Even under slavery, I'm told the people could fly. As Dr. King says in the closing lines of his speech, quote, "The oceans of history are made turbulent by the ever-rising tides of hate. History is cluttered with the wreckage of nations and individuals that pursued this self-defeating path of hate. As Arnold Toynbee says, love is the ultimate force that makes for the saving choice of life and good against the damning choice of death and evil. Therefore, the first hope in our inventory must be the hope that love is going to have the last word. So we sit, we chant, we wrap each other's pain in a unity of voices and sing. Deep in my heart, I do believe we shall overcome someday. The greatest threat to crowd control is our individual yearning for something better. Maybe it is in the clouds, but it is definitely in company with each other. We are not hungry for the brains of the living. We have our own, thank you very much. We are yearning to connect with others, to be engaged in collective action. The greatest source of our self-defense against the mob mentality of law and order politics is each other. This is not a romantic notion of connection. It is not about connecting as couples or nice, neat households, not because we are friends or lovers or because we share a common social network, but because we know and share a common knowledge that the personal is political. But the impersonal is powerful. Our greatest liability is thinking we have to go it alone, that we should trust no one, that no one gets us or our struggle, that we are surrounded by those who will misread and abuse us. No doubt they are. No doubt they will. No doubt they are legion, but they are not the end of our world, even if they kill us. Chances are they all have their own struggles too. Strength in numbers is not only about meeting the might of the opposition with everything we got. It's about each of us finding strength in ourselves we never knew possible at the side of another we don't have to share blood or fluids with to feel. It is about fellowship within the fray of friction. We might not all feel the same for the same reasons, but we don't have to. We are not mercenaries. We are defending ourselves against the modern threats of mass disposability. We are not just hungry. We are starving. We could become one rather than scramble to defend our stuff and our families. Together, there are no individual selves to be defended. Together, self-defense is collective transformation. This has been Radicalizing Dharma Dreams, written by Jasmine Syedullah, PhD, read by Naomi Kirst-Schultz. Thanks for reading along with me.